Hello, my friends, and welcome to today's episode of Stand Up with Pete Dominic Daily. I try to be here every day for you with a great news rundown, a clip show, and an excellent guest. And joining me today for the first time is Emma Brown. She's the executive director of the Giffords and Giffords Law Center, Giffords Courage to Fight Gun Violence. Great conversation with Emma. And if you want to jump to my guest, it starts at 51 minutes in today's show. But I've got your headlines, I've got your clips, and I've got your back. I don't know exactly what that meant. I don't necessarily have your back. I may or may not. Somebody does, I hope, from our community. That's a huge part of the stand-up community, is looking out for one another, connecting with one another, and I hope to see you at some of you at tonight's Hangout, 8 p.m. East tonight. Here it is on June 30th, a Monday. Hope you had a good weekend. And hopefully you are all charged up and fired up and inspired to take on the week ahead of you. I'm just kidding. You're probably exhausted and stressed and anxious and worried about what the hell's going to happen today in your life or in the life of the world of all of us. And that's what we're here for. Collectively, together, to get through it, to figure it out, and navigate it with each other's support as much as possible. If you're not in the Discord platform, you're missing out, because our friend Megan here in New York is posing a question of the day that are great questions that she's putting in Discord that more and more of you are answering each and every day. But I highly recommend you connect with others on the Stand Up with Pete Dominic Discord platform channel. And specifically, that question of the day, the daily question, is a fun thing. What is the best way to spend a rainy day? Was yesterday's. The day before that, if you could hang out with any cartoon character, who would you choose and why? And one more. If you had to teach a class on one thing, what would you teach? 26 responses from listeners, subscribers, supporters, members of our community in there, and just that one answer. So more and more of you will be getting engaged. Thank you very much, Megan, for doing that. If you've got a good idea for the show, for the community, for a gathering like the one we're going to have in September, send it my way, standupwithpete@gmail.com. And I hope that you will come or consider coming to Farm Jam in Central New York, closest airport, Syracuse, New York, on the Finger Lakes region. It's going to be a beautiful time of year, and Kevin Richberg's farm is going to be in blossom. Time to harvest the orchard. So join us. Okay, let's get to the headlines, clips, and then my conversation with Emma Brown. Where do we start today? Generally speaking, my editorial standard here at the Stand-Up Newsroom in terms of which stories to report, and often the order to report them in, giving them each enough time, and even that's not very much, is which stories, which news item is affecting the most people the most. How much impact does this news story or headline have? That's generally how I pick that. So I think you've got to be thinking a lot about and focused on this huge, giant, comprehensive piece of legislation that is officially called the Big Beautiful Bill. But of course, that is only because we have a cartoon president, and it's a pretty terrible idea. Just barely passed out of the House of Representatives, I think by one vote. And now, of course, it's in the Senate. The goal is to pass it by July 4th. And at one point I told you I had heard it was going to be kicked into August. And apparently they are still trying to get this done by Independence Day. And the president will then celebrate it and go on some kind of victory lap. But the Senate Sunday afternoon began debate on this mega bill. Democrats will use their allotted 10 hours. Republicans are expected not to. The Senate will begin its vote-a-rama at 9 a.m. today, during which time senators will offer amendments to the bill. Overnight, Sunday, the parliamentarian ruled more provisions out of order with the reconciliation process Republicans are using to pass the bill with a simple majority. Now, if it passes in the Senate, the bill will go back to the House to consider the changes that the Senate made to the House's version of the bill, which passed again, like I said, by one vote. It is ugly, it is bad, and I think it is likely to pass, although don't check my analysis, because Senator Tom Tillis yesterday railed against the mega bill's impact specifically on Medicaid. He, of course, is a senator from North Carolina. He also announced that he would be retiring because he doesn't want to have to deal with the primary challenge pressure, apparently. I think he was open about that and open about how honest he felt when he didn't have to run for reelection, which I thought was interesting. I've got a little bit of audio from his fiery floor speech in the clip show. I do think that is probably the biggest piece of news. I think it's probably the most important thing to be thinking about, discussing, and burning up phone lines to your red state senators with pressure that they don't pass this. And there's all kinds of organizations that are helping facilitate those phone calls if you want to get on board. But writing about this in today's newsletter, Heather Cox Richardson says Jeff Stein of the Washington Post reported that today Republicans' budget reconciliation bill makes the biggest cut ever to programs for low-income Americans. Those cuts have made many Republicans skittish about supporting the measure. After Trump attacked him yesterday for not supporting the budget reconciliation, Senator Tom Tillis has announced he will not run for re-election next year, indicating his unwillingness to face a primary challenger backed by Trump. This puts the seat in play for Democratic pickup. Later on, she mentions the Senate parliamentarian has told senators that several of the provisions added to the Republicans' budget reconciliation bill violate the rules for budget reconciliation bills. Those provisions include the ones added to the bill to win the support of Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Today, Trump pushed Republican senators to ignore the Senate parliamentarian who judges whether proposed measures adhere to Senate rules. Yeah, he just said ignore them. He posted on social media, quote, an unelected Senate staffer, parliamentarian, parentheses, should not be allowed to hurt the Republicans' bill. Once many fantastic things out, period. No exclamation mark, DJT, period. That's what he wrote. Yep. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office yesterday said the tax cuts in the budget reconciliation bill that Republican senators are trying to pass will increase the national debt by $3.3 trillion over the next 10 years, despite the $1.2 trillion in cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and the National Institutes of Health, CDC, and other programs over the same period. Senator Raphael Warnock called the measure Robin Hood in reverse, stealing from the poor in order to give to the rich. This massive transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. This is socialism for the rich. It's my Warnock impression. I don't think it's too offensive. Again, our dear leader, our mad little tiny king, has demanded the measure's passage by the 4th of July, in part because he needs the Department of Homeland Security, who's blown through its budget and needs supplemental funding the bill will provide. Yeah, so he needs this bill passed so he can hurt more people's lives by snatching them off the streets and trying to deport them to third world countries. That funding adds an astonishing $45 billion for migrant detention by immigration. But I mean, it's an astonishing number that he's taking from vulnerable people, food assistance and health care to give to ICE to deport people. $45 billion to ICE. The current budget of $3.4 billion over the next 5 years and $14.4 billion for transportation and removal. I mean, it's just astonishing, and I wish we'd hear more people talk about that. I'm glad Heather Cox Richardson talked about that in her letter. I'm not sure that I would have picked up on it if I hadn't read full-length newspaper articles about what's in this bill, which we all should be doing as much as possible to try to understand it, but it only sometimes makes it more scary to know. And Chuck Schumer, he tried to slow the passage of the measure by forcing a reading of the entire 940-page bill in the Senate, but I'm not sure where the status of that effort is. But they'll have to put Republicans on record for controversial issues, and I'm not sure how much it will matter, but that really is today's biggest story I've got to mention. Yesterday's most tragic big headline that we may have seen before I went to bed or when you woke up, that some guy in Idaho, I'm assuming it's a man, he started a fire, got firefighters to respond to the fire, and then he assassinated them with a sniper rifle, it would seem. The suspected gunman is also dead in this rural town in Idaho. It's a tragic story. It's a terrible story, and we will soon find out who this person was, and hopefully why he did it. And then someone will say he's a lone wolf, even though he was radicalized by his church. I actually have no idea anything about this guy at all, but that could be a fair prediction. Oh, he was just mentally ill. He'd really just lost. Oh, wow. How'd he get a sniper rifle? Was there a silencer on it? Talk about that with Emma Brown today. Okay, now moving on. Other more important stories. It should be mentioned a good news story that Senator Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, he said yesterday that he's dropping that contentious bill that I talked about with Wes Seiler did a day about public lands, to sell millions of acres of public lands. I mean, they're still making an effort to sell land, no doubt. But from this bill, this amendment, they took it out from the sweeping domestic policy package that the Senate is going to be begin debating. He made the announcement on social media after it became clear that the plan faced an insurmountable opposition from within his own party. At least 4 Republican senators from western states have said they plan to vote for an amendment to strike the proposal from the bill. So there you go. It triggered an intense pushback from conservative hunters and outdoorsmen across the American West, who had warned that it threatened the lands where they hunted and fished. So we'll take whatever whatever the common interest is. Working together with people is really very important, pragmatic, and see, there you go, an accomplishment. And we'll see what happens with the big trying to sell off America effort. Another news story I think is important, that our dear leaders' tariff war and weaker consumer spending has translated to a contraction of 0.5% in the U.S. economy in the first quarter. That is no small thing, even more of a drop than the 0.2% that economists were predicting. Heather Cox Richardson says the economy Trump inherited from President Joe Biden led the world in productivity. And now look, another big news story yesterday from the Washington Post is that apparently there are intercepted communications that we've gotten a hold of. I guess this is going to have to be another leak Trump's going to lose his mind about, but that showed that senior Iranian officials said that the U.S. attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities caused less damage than they had expected, and that they'd wondered why the strikes were so restrained. So that's a pretty interesting news story. What else do I have for you? A Ukrainian pilot was killed and his F-16 fighter jet crashed after Russia launched a huge aerial assault involving hundreds of drones and scores of missiles overnight on Saturday. The Ukrainian military says the airman was the 3rd F-16 pilot killed since Ukrainians began flying jets last summer, and his plane was the 4th F-16 Ukraine has lost since then. Deadly aerial attacks, and the numbers are just, trying to pay attention to that war alone is a full-time job, I think, and just terrifying for the people of Ukraine and these conscripts from Russia, and the whole thing continues to be a disaster. I thought it was going to be over on day one. And then heading to Gaza, Israel has ordered evacuations in northern Gaza as Trump continues to push for a ceasefire on that conflict. Somehow he hasn't gotten it there. At least 10 were killed in new shooting near a Gaza aid site, and Israel continues to bombard Gaza City. It's just it's terrifying, horrifying, and hard to imagine that violence there as well. Doctors Without Borders calling for Gaza food distribution system to be dismantled now. So the chaos continues in the Middle East as well. And coming back home, I feel like I just want to mention a couple of developments over the weekend with our Mad King and what he's done and said, one of which is just hard to imagine that may be a thing. But the American president is telling Israel that if they don't stop prosecuting their prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, that America will not give them all of the military aid that we give them. Okay? Trump is threatening to cut off billions in funding to Israel if corruption charges against the prime minister there are not dropped. He posted to Truth Social late Saturday night time in recent days, railing against the ongoing corruption trial of the Israeli prime minister, in which Netanyahu is facing 3 different accusations of quid pro quos in which he allegedly granted favors to businessmen in exchange for bribes and friendly media coverage. And now our president is threatening to withhold billions if Israel stops charging their leader for corruption. How else can you interpret this? How should this be interpreted? It is wildly inappropriate, unprecedented, and unethical. The idea that you're now going to pressure other countries not to prosecute their corrupt leaders is, well, I guess right on brand, right? Okay, so another big story about the failure of the Iran attacks, the bombing of Iran, is that the guy who would know best, Rafael Grossi, he is the UN nuclear inspector, is saying that Iran could be enriching fuel again in a matter of months. The chief United Nations nuclear inspectors widened the divide with the Trump administration over how severely the United States set back Iran's nuclear program, declaring it could be enriching uranium in, quote, a matter of months. The guy who knows best outside of Iran is saying a matter of months. He said that the United States dropping 14 bunker-busting bombs in Iran's two uranium enrichment centers. Well, the damage was severe, but not total. So not obliterated then? Trump also, by the way, is threatening to withhold New York City funding if Mamdani becomes the mayor and defies the president. So there's that threat. He's inserted himself already in New York City politics as well. And one more headline I wanted to mention, a surprise tax in the big bad bill in the Senate version could cripple wind and solar power. Wind and solar power companies already bracing for Congress to end their federal subsidies. But now in the Senate bill, they're actually going to try to penalize those industries and talk about free markets. When you subsidize an industry, it's not a free market. And that's what the government has been doing for all of our energy sources forever, starting obviously with oil and coal. They also incentivize wind and solar. But now they're taking away the incentives for the renewables, but they're keeping them for the dirty fossil fuels that are destroying our planet. And now, not only that, on the back end, they're going to penalize the renewable energy that is growing the fastest and that the rest of the world is on board with and investing heavily in. Read more about it at the New York Times. Brad Plumer is a great reporter, and he's writing all about that story. All right, well, that is all I've got for you in the headlines. It's time to get to the clips, the clip show. Got a lot of clips from the Sunday shows and more. But let's start with reaction to some of the Supreme Court decisions that came down on Friday. Hopefully you heard my conversation with Eric Siegel, which I posted yesterday. Hopefully you heard my conversation with Chrissy Greer as well, which I dropped on Saturday because I didn't unfortunately get to show up on Friday. But now a few clips referring back to those decisions on Friday that are going to affect all of our lives for a long time, arguably. Starting with Ali Mistal, who shared this terrifying metaphor on Velshi on MSNBC.
Walk me through why you see this ruling as deeply dangerous, not for people who are birthright citizens, but much more broadly for every American.
Imagine Donald Trump wants to do something illegal to you, Ali Velshi. Imagine that he wants to murder you. Imagine that he and Stephen Miller release an entire policy explaining about how they can murder Canadian journalists who are working in America because they're taking the jobs from real American journalists, right? So he's going to murder you. So you, Ali Velshi, you go to court. You go to court in the Southern District of New York and you say, like, I don't think this murder thing is constitutional. It's clearly illegal. It's clearly constitutional. Donald Trump and Pam Bondi and Stephen Miller shouldn't be able to have a plan to murder me. And the court says, you're right, Ali Velshi. There's no way Donald Trump is allowed to murder you. We're going to have an injunction. We're going to stay the executive order saying that he's going to murder Canadian journalists. And so you're like, great, awesome. And you go home. And then Pat Kiernan shows up and he's like, what about me? I'm also a Canadian. Mm-hmm. Ashley Banfield shows up. She's, I'm also a Canadian. What about me? And the court's, well, I can't help you because Ali Velshi is the one who's sued. So Pat Kiernan, if you don't want to be murdered, you have to launch your entire own lawsuit in the Southern District of New York again to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't murder you. And while the Supreme Court is deciding who the Ali Velshi can't be murdered injunction applies to, guess what? Donald Trump starts murdering people. That is the upshot of yesterday's decision. Donald Trump has declared that he is going to do an unconstitutional thing. And various people have been able to secure the court's order that he cannot do the unconstitutional thing to them. And basically what the Supreme Court has said is that, well, you said something about Jimmy, but you didn't say anything about Consuela, so we're going to deport Consuela while the Supreme Court figures it out.
Okie dokie. There you go. Ali Mistal putting it one way, that way for you, and I appreciate it. Let's head over to Jamie Raskin, who had this interpretation of one part of the
As the dissenting opinions point out here, the implications of this decision are just breathtaking because, of course, if you have a religious free exercise right to opt out of a compulsory exercise, for example, what the Supreme Court said in West Virginia versus Barnett, it applies not just to an exercise of religious conscience, but a conscience generally. If there are, Jehovah's Witness kids who don't want to participate in the compulsory flag salute, it also applies to kids who are internationalists or pacifists or what have you. And it's the same thing here. If you can opt out of mandatory classroom readings because it offends your religious objections, you can do it because it offends your philosophical, beliefs, your political beliefs, your moral beliefs, or what have you. And the court basically says, well, we'll deal with all of that down the road. There's going to be a lot more cases where people are saying, our family doesn't believe in evolution, so we don't want our kid to be in class when evolution is taught. It offends our religion. Our family doesn't believe in war, so we don't want our kids in class when World War II is being taught about. And so the courts are going to have to figure that out. And so, again, they're trying to flatter a particular political group, a mega group here. And I think it's going to cause chaos going forward in terms of trying to figure out what it means to have a public education system.
Well, you can imagine just the remarkable possibility of books schools just taking books off the shelves, so their libraries.
All right, that was Jim Sciutto on CNN with Jamie Raskin there. And now let's head over to NBC Meet the Press, where Kirsten Welker had on Senator Chris Murphy. I've got a couple clips from, but here's one, and this is a reaction to her question about one of the judgments.
As you know, the Supreme Court did issue that ruling this week, which effectively will limit judges' ability to issue nationwide injunctions. You just heard my conversation with Senator Mullen about this. What is your reaction to what the Supreme Court ruled this week?
Well, first, let's just talk about what it means for kids that are born in this country. Both the Constitution and the law is clear. If you're born in the United States of America, you're a U.S. citizen. But now, because there's no longer going to be a federal policy, it's going to be different in every state. A child born in the United States, born in Connecticut, will be a citizen, but that same child, if they were born in Oklahoma, might not be. That's chaos. By taking away the power of courts to restrain the president when he is clearly acting in an unlawful manner, as he is when he says that children born in the United States are no longer citizens, you are assisting him in trying to undermine the rule of law and undermine our democracy. So that case is really dangerous because it sets up a patchwork of citizenship laws, but it's really dangerous because it will incentivize the president to act in a lawless manner, because now only the Supreme Court, who can only take a handful of cases a year, can ever stop him from violating the laws and the Constitution.
Let's turn to...
All right, there you go. There's Chris Murphy on Meet the Press, laying it out another way. And finally, Jessica Tarlov, the liberal voice on Fox News' The Five, put it this way.
And then we have this class action approach. To the idea that it is Democrats that only use that, it's blatantly false. The reason that we don't have student debt forgiveness from President Biden is because the Republicans went and got a nationwide injunction. People like AG Ken Paxton in Texas. There's a judge in East Texas that he likes a lot that puts out injunctions for the entire nation, super right-wing guy. So let's not make this about partisan politics.
They clarified that.
All right, there you go. There she goes. Jessica Tarlov, good job on Fox News. Let's get to the other big story here. I've got a lot of sound about. This is the big bad bill. This is Senator Chris Murphy on Meet the Press saying, well, it might not pass to Kirsten Welker.
Are two Republicans who say they are a no on this legislation. Senator Murphy, do you think there's any chance that the so-called big beautiful bill does not pass the Senate?
I do think there's a chance it doesn't pass. They are trying to ram it through as quickly as they can, likely in the middle of the night tonight, because every day that this bill hangs out there, it becomes less popular. As you noted, by almost a 2-to-1 margin, the American people hate this piece of legislation because it's going to represent the biggest transfer of wealth and money from the poor and the middle class to the rich in the history of the country. It's not about efficiencies in Medicaid. CBO, which is the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan, says it's going to kick between 10 and 15 million people off their health care. And for what? to be able to afford a new $270,000 tax cut for the richest families in the country, new tax cuts for corporations, new tax cuts for billionaires. This bill stinks. It's a moral abomination. Everybody that learns about it hates it. And so there's a chance that it won't pass. That's in part why we're forcing them to read it, because every single day that people learn about it, they're flooding their members' offices with calls to tell them to stop this bill. Nobody is asking for 16 million people to lose their health care just so that corporations and the very rich can get a new tax cut. That's super unpopular, and we're going to work this thing until the final vote.
You know, the final vote, by the way, Chris Murphy, might come down to your Senate colleague there, Tom Tillis, who I mentioned the whole story about yesterday. Well, here he is giving a fiery speech on the Senate floor yesterday. Will he be the John McCain of this bill to kill it? We'll see.
They can't find a hole in my estimate. So what they told me is that, yeah, it's rough, but North Carolina's used the system. They're going to have to make it work. All right. So what do I tell 663,000 people in 2 years or 3 years when President Trump breaks his promise by pushing them off of Medicaid because the funding's not there anymore, guys? In the White House, senators advising the president are not telling him that the effect of this bill is to break a promise. And you know, the last time I saw a promise broken around health care, with respect to my friends on the other side of the aisle, it's when somebody said, if you like your health care, you can keep it. If you like your doctor, you can keep it. We found out that wasn't true. That made me the second Republican Speaker of the House since the Civil War, ladies and gentlemen, because we betrayed the promise to the American people. 3 years later, it actually made me a U.S. Senator, because in 2010, it had just been proposed. And just anticipation of what was going to happen was enough to have a sea change election that swept Republicans into the majority for the second time in 100 years. Now, Republicans are about to make a mistake on health care and betraying a promise. It is inescapable that this bill in its current form will betray the very promise that Donald J. Trump made in the Oval Office or in the cabinet room when I was there with finance, where he said we can go after waste, fraud, and abuse on any programs.
Okay. There's just a little bit of Tom Tillis yesterday, and we'll see how he continues to behave moving forward. But he's not running for re-election. What's he got to lose? Now, somebody who's got a lot to lose is Senator Mark Wayne Mullen. Yeah, that guy. He was back on TV saying nonsense, and I've got a couple minutes of it here because you've got to hear it. You've got to hear. I give you the full spectrum here, as many different takes as I can, especially to help you call the nonsense and call the bullshit and get it fact-checked, which you'll hear from Aaron Carroll in a moment here, and it's very satisfying after hearing Senator Mark Wayne Mullen.
What has been one of the biggest sticking points, the issue of Medicaid. Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, as we mentioned, says he's voting against the bill because he believes it includes funding cuts that will force his state to decide whose coverage to eliminate and what critical services to cut. Senator, as you know, President Trump promised no Medicaid cuts. Is the big, beautiful bill a broken promise?
Absolutely not. What we're doing is cutting the waste, fraud, and abuse, and I want to use that word abuse, out of the Medicaid system and make sure it's for the people that it was originally intended for. Keep in mind, right now, there's 35 million people that live under the poverty line inside the United States. Yet there's 70 million that's on Medicaid. Yeah. Now, it's unsustainable. Medicaid was designed for those in the most dire need, and that's what we need to make sure it's there for. Now, what people are upset about, especially in states, is ever since Obamacare, there's been this loophole that allows the states to actually charge providers an exorbitant amount to pay their share. And so instead of the states paying their share, they're charging the providers, which one requires the United States taxpayers and other states to offset these high provider taxes inside different states. North Carolina has a high provider tax. Yeah. What we're saying is it needs to be even. Every state should be the same, and so we're gradually bringing down what states provide and making it even across the board. And so there's an even playing field. So one state like Oklahoma isn't offsetting high provider taxes in North Carolina or California.
But, Senator, 7.8 million people are expected to lose Medicaid coverage, and you cited the 35 million figure there. Are you suggesting that 35 million people covered by Medicaid are all involved in waste, fraud, and abuse?
No. What I'm saying is how do you explain that we only have 35, I don't want to use that as a derogatory term, but I just want to use the numbers here. There's 35 million people under the poverty line inside the United States, and there's 70 million people that are signed up for Medicaid. Where are you going to tell me that there's not room to cut fraud, waste, and abuse in the program? People that are today eligible for it underneath current programs are still going to be eligible for it tomorrow, too. We're just getting out the ones that should never be there. I mean, what is so hard about requiring an able-bodied individual with no dependents, no sickness, to work 20 hours a week? I know you work more than 20 hours this weekend alone.
All right. So ridiculous, and only creates way more bureaucracy and will cost more money, not save it. This able-bodied bullshit, it drives me out of my mind. First of all, we should give everybody health insurance, whether they're able-bodied or not. Access to affordable health insurance and health care is a human right. Let's start there. And then we can unpack the lies. But here are more lies from Senator from Alabama, Katie Britt, on CNN.
Talk about them in terms of your constituents, because there are about 760,000 Alabamans who rely on Medicaid. The bill will also cut federal funding for food stamps. It will require states to kick in more and shift a lot of that cost to Alabama. And that's more than 750,000 Alabamans who rely on what we're going to call food stamps, including 330,000 children. So are you guaranteeing that these changes that you were voting for Monday, presumably, will not hurt recipients in Alabama of Medicaid, of food stamps or SNAP, for those who are citizens and for those who truly need it and deserve it?
Absolutely. So when you look at Medicaid, children, obviously, we have the Children's Health Insurance Program. So children are absolutely not touched by this. Same thing when it comes to SNAP benefits. So we've made sure that that is taken off the table. What you're talking about is able-bodied, working-aged Americans without dependents at home, having them work, train, volunteer in some capacity 20 hours a week in order to receive those government benefits. This goes back to Bill Clinton era politics, when you know that being a part of something bigger than yourselves, helping to contribute, is ultimately what we need to do. And it's actually the American people agree with us on this. But when you look at what's happening in Alabama specifically, you know, you think about what you mentioned with regards to SNAP. What we're doing on that is ensuring that states have some skin in the game. If you have an error rate that is down below 6%, which Alabama is about a percentage point, a little bit over that, above that, we will have time. We have several years to make sure that we get that percentage point down. And I have every faith and belief that we will. We've got to make sure that these overpayments, underpayments that are happening, we've seen it in our own state where people's benefits are being stolen from other states, that stuff stops. If states, obviously, under the Biden administration, we stopped that accountability during for the SNAP program. Reinstituting it and ensuring that states have some skin in the game will ultimately help us be able to deliver these resources and services that these people so desperately need.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard your fellow Senator Tuberville talk about he's worried that your state can't afford it. Your state can't afford to pick up the slack.
What we can afford to do is get it right. And so if you think about moving that percentage rate down.
All right. Now, that fact check I promised from Dr. Aaron Carroll, whose YouTube channel is award-winning. Healthcare Triage News covered this back in 2018, and I think it's a very good explainer. You can watch it with all the graphics and so on, but I think all 3 minutes, hopefully, is worth it to you. Here he is.
News is focused on work requirements for Medicaid. Trump administration sure seems open to them. They seem more than willing to allow states to apply restrictions on able-bodied adults who might apply for the program. Let's chat about that. This is Healthcare Triage News. As is often the case, the language around these types of requirements sounds reasonable. If there's no reason for an able-bodied adult not to work, then it's possible that setting some requirements might nudge some of them to improve their lives. Given the high cost of programs like Medicaid, it also seems reasonable to make cuts on those people who are the most able to make do without it. But how many able-bodied adults are on Medicaid? A Kaiser Family Foundation analysis from spring of 2017 found that almost 80% of adults in Medicaid are from working families. Almost 60% are working themselves, and this is without any work requirements at all. Of those who don't work, about 35% are unable to because of disability or illness. Another 28% are taking care of other members of their families in lieu of jobs. Of those that remain, 18% are students, 8% are looking for work but can't find it, and 8% are retired. That leaves about 3% of the non-working adult Medicaid population who we could possibly define as able-bodied yet choosing not to work. A more recent study published in JAMA Internal Medicine in December 2017 focused on Michigan and surveyed more than 4,000 people already enrolled in Medicaid for at least a year. About half of respondents reported that they were employed in some way. Another 4.5% were stay-at-home moms or dads. 5.2% were students, and 2.5% were retired. More than 11% were unable to work. That left about 28% who were out of work. Out-of-work adults were more likely to be older, age 51 to 64 years. More likely to be in fair or poor health, have a chronic mental health condition, or a physical or mental functional limitation. The true number of healthy, able-bodied adults who could work but choose not to is small. Given that, it's worth considering the cost to administer programs such as these. They aren't cheap, nor are they easy. Forcing those who have jobs to prove that they are employed adds an extra layer of administrative burden that could cause eligible people to lose their coverage if they don't comply with more regulations. Confirming that unemployed adults meet qualifications for not working, perhaps due to disability or illness, will require states to invest in compliance personnel and procedures that will raise the cost of the program itself. They will further need to follow beneficiaries who are trying to find work but unable to land a job. That won't be straightforward either. So what evidence do we have about how this might play out? The closest analogy might be our experience in placing work requirements onto the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families TANF program, which involves federal block grant funds for states to help low-income parents and children. As with Medicaid, people receiving TANF largely worked even without work requirements. Those who didn't work often couldn't. The new requirements didn't lead to significant increases in employment or reduced poverty. They also cost a lot to implement. Look, here's what we don't know. We don't know if creating new work requirements will yield large savings. We don't know how many deserving beneficiaries might be kicked off of Medicaid by mistake. We don't know how much it will cost to implement these programs, and it's possible that it costs more than they save. We don't even know if this policy will incentivize more able-bodied beneficiaries to work, which is the whole point in the first place. Given that, I don't know why so many states are eager to rush to implement work requirements for Medicaid recipients. But we're doing it.
Well, they didn't do it. They failed to do it, I believe, back then, but they're trying to do it again now. And so his argument and statistics, I'm sure, are pretty close, if not even worse, for Republicans making this argument. Now let's go to MSNBC, who was hosting Senator Mark Warner of Virginia and asked about this.
They know, and they talk to us on Background as reporters. They talk to our colleagues in that room, those rooms behind me, about how they don't like this bill. What do they tell you about why they're supporting it? And if the only answer is Trump, maybe that's it. But there has to be something deeper.
Well, Eugene, actually, a lot of it just is Trump. And I wish I could say, oh, they're only, talking bad, talking trash on this bill, but not other things. The amount of stuff I hear from my Republicans around national security items, where they are privately embarrassed at the careless handling of classified information or the overstating of what happened on the bombing raid in Iran. But, I've had a bunch of them say to me, Mark, you keep telling us this stuff. And I haven't had one say, Mark, it's like you're our conscience. I don't want to be your damn conscience. I want you to vote your conscience. It has been the most, I've been doing this job for a while, but this last 5 months has been some of the most heartbreaking since I've been doing it, because it just, come on, guys, if this is what you believe, stand up, These jobs are not so valuable that if you happen to put that job on the line, and you do the right thing, you're going to be able to sleep a hell of a lot better.
That part.
All right, there you go. It's got a weird voice. Something's going on with Senator Mark Warner's voice. But let's go back to Mark Wayne Mullen back on Meet the Press. I know you don't want to hear it, but you got to listen to this because this is the other good question I think that matters. What about Elon Musk? He, over the weekend, went off on the bill again. I forgot to mention that earlier. I think that's an important development, that the louder he is about it, the more it matters. I could be wrong, but she asks him anyway.
Senator, I hear what you're saying. The CBO actually says that middle-income households would only see an overall increase between $500 to $1,000, not that full $10,000 you cited. Let me delve into some of the broader opposition, though, that we're seeing. In the most recent polling in the bill, 59% of voters say they oppose it. And Elon Musk posted yesterday that the bill is, quote, political suicide for the Republican Party. Do you think this legislation could cost Republicans in the midterms, Senator?
No, well, let's unpack some of the stuff you said. What the CBO was talking about was actual bring home pay. When you start talking about the child deduction or the child deduction that we actually doubled, when you start talking about the taxes that they are going to see the increase, plus you start looking at the increase in wage bring home, that's where we get the 10,000. CBO, what you're talking about specifically is just the extension of the tax cuts. So there's a lot of other factors at play in there. As far as Elon Musk goes, listen, I respect Elon. I think he's right for his opinion, but he just doesn't know. And so I have to disregard that. What we're doing is delivering for the American people, and they know that. So if you look at any polling in the red states, especially where President Trump won, which he won the red states overwhelmingly, President Trump is popular, and the bill is extremely popular. Other polls can be, as you know, decided by what demographic you want to poll. And I imagine if they were to go poll blue states, well, the bill probably wouldn't be popular there.
Senator, I hear what you're saying about Elon Musk. Back in February on this program, you called Elon Musk, quote, the best entrepreneur we've ever had in our lifetime.
And I mean that.
Okay, so why would you dismiss his perspective, Senator?
Well, I used to be in business full time. Is what I did. I was never in politics. I thought I understood politics until I got in it. When I got into it, I realized, whoa. First thing I had to do is learn how to take a big, deep breath and realize I have to accept other people's opinion. That's what negotiating is. And then
all right, there you go. Mark Wayne Mullen. And one more. This is Rand Paul saying this bill is going to balloon the deficit or destroy the debt ceiling, and Republicans will be taken to task for it. Will they? I don't know.
Once this bill votes and this debt ceiling goes through, the debt is owned by the GOP, and there is no more campaigning and saying this is the Democrats. It will be owned by the Republicans, and I think that's a huge mistake.
All right. There you go. That's all the reaction I've got to the bill. And now I want to go to just a few more clips, a couple from Zohran Mamdani, who I continue to be impressed with, are a lot of people who learn about him. Not everybody, obviously, but I thought he was really good on Meet the Press, and I wanted to share this question with you.
Start with your remarkable victory in the primary for mayor. You're 33 years old. As I just said, you started out at close to 0% in the polls, Mr. Mamdani. You came back to topple one of the biggest names in New York politics, Andrew Cuomo. What was the secret to your success? Do you think it was your message? Do you think that voters were voting against Andrew Cuomo? A little bit of both? How do you see it?
I think ultimately it was the focus on the fact that we live in the most expensive city in the United States of America. It's also the wealthiest city in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and yet 1 in 4 New Yorkers are living in poverty, and the rest are seemingly trapped in a state of anxiety. And what we've seen is that this is a city that needs to be affordable for the people who build it every day. Our focus was on exactly that. And by keeping that focus on an economic agenda, we showed New Yorkers that this could be more than just a museum of what once was. It could be a living, breathing testament to possibility.
Oh, sounds like even Kirsten Welker is impressed. Now, how about his response to the President of the United States, calling him all kinds of names and attacking him?
The President of the United States has had to say, he's had a lot to say about your campaign. He called you a communist. Because he's the president, I want to give you a chance to respond directly to him. How do you respond? Are you a communist?
No, I am not. And I have already had to start to get used to the fact that the president will talk about how I look, how I sound, where I'm from, who I am, ultimately because he wants to distract from what I'm fighting for. And I'm fighting for the very working people that he ran a campaign to empower that he has since then betrayed. And when we talk about my politics, you know, I call myself a democratic socialist in many ways inspired by the words of Dr. King from decades ago, who said, call it democracy or call it democratic socialism. There has to be a better distribution of wealth for all of God's children in this country. And as income inequality has declined nationwide, it has increased in New York City. And ultimately, what we need is a city where every single person can thrive.
Yeah, how about it, huh? I like it. I like it a lot. I like what he says and the way he says it. Way it's delivered. You know what I don't like is Senator Tommy Tuberville, who had this horrific racist thing to say on some popular right-wing podcast.
You know, I've spoken several times with Tom Homan, who is basically running the inner city ICE programs. And, you know, he told me, he said he's been pushed at every corner when he goes to these big cities. I'm sure if you get a mayor like this that takes over, it'll even be worse. And that's when you can stop the federal funding. You can do anything. President Trump can do anything he wants when it comes to the federal. Again, these inner city rats, they live off the federal government. And that's one reason we're $37 trillion in debt. And it's time that we find these rats and we send them back home that are living off the American taxpayers that are working very hard every week to pay taxes.
Wow. I don't think it gets much more racist than calling people animals, and specifically rats. Specifically inner city rats. He is a real POS. Hard to believe he coached Division I football, went on recruiting trips in the inner cities. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. Well, even some Democrats don't necessarily support Mamdani, at least not yet, including Hakeem Jeffries, who has always been fairly beholden to the kind of Israeli lobby as a congressman in New York. But he doesn't love Mamdani's comments about from the river to the sea, which I think he also was asked about. I didn't grab those clips. I just saw them. But I don't like those comments necessarily either. I don't think they're helpful, just like I don't think a lot of other certain types of phrases are helpful because they get misinterpreted and then demagogued to death and bludgeoned. But here he is, Hakeem Jeffries, trying to make that point on ABC's This Week with Jonathan Karl.
You mentioned the diversity of your district, including a lot of Jewish constituents. Mamdani has made comments that some have said veered towards anti-Semitism. His initial statement after October 7th, he criticized the Israeli government but didn't criticize Hamas. He defended the use of the word globalize, or the phrase globalize intifada. And he even said that the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu should be arrested, or he would, if he were mayor, he would arrest Netanyahu if he visited New York City. Do these things concern you?
Globalizing the intifada, by way of example, is not an acceptable phrase, and he's going to have to clarify his position on that as he moves forward. With respect to the Jewish communities that I represent, I think our nominee is going to have to convince folks that he is prepared to aggressively address the rise in anti-Semitism in the city of New York, which has been an unacceptable development. And any mayor, whether you're a Democratic mayor, a Republican mayor, an independent mayor, has got to commit to the safety and well-being of all of the people of the city of New York. And when there are moments of crisis and a rise in anti-Jewish hate, that's a threshold, of course, needs to be corrected.
All right. Needs to be corrected, I think, there. Okay, so there's going to be a lot more conversation about that and everything else that you heard from. I do have one more clip here. I guess didn't fit anywhere else in the lineup, but it's, again, Senator Chris Murphy on Meet the Press, and I just like the way that he answered Kirsten Welker's leading question, and I really get annoyed when people who have been covering politics in Congress, like Kirsten Welker and several others in corporate media and elsewhere, that don't take into consideration how much Republicans have derailed all kinds of immigration reform for the last 10 years that would do so many different things to solve the problems that we face each and every day in this country, but somehow blames it on Democrats and tries to give credit to Republicans. Anyway, I thought that Chris Murphy explains this perfectly here. Well, not that point I made, but a better, more important, relevant point.
Border crossings are at a record low. Do you give the Trump administration some credit for that? And are you, when you look at those figures, do you think things are moving in the right direction, at least in that regard, Senator?
No, I don't give them credit for that because border crossings are low because they're violating the law every day. So we have a law in this country that says if you are fleeing terror or torture from another country, you can come here and apply for asylum. The Trump administration has suspended that law. They are not allowing anybody to come here to apply for asylum. We wrote that bipartisan bill last year to reform the asylum process, to make sure that only the right people are coming in and that we judge those cases expeditiously at the border. So it's true, there are very few people crossing on a daily basis, but that's because the Trump administration is violating the law. And it should matter to every American that on so many facets, the Trump administration doesn't care about the law. This is becoming a lawless administration. We are on a road to see our democracy atrophy to the point that it will be unrecognizable. And the border is just one example of many ways in which this administration doesn't care about the law anymore.
All right, there it is. There you go. 49 minutes of headlines and clips. And I am way behind this morning, as I too often am, but hopefully I'll get this up to you by about 7:15 a.m., but not if I don't wrap it right now. So that's the news, and now it's time to get to my conversation with Emma Brown, who I was happy to talk to for the first time here on the show. If you've been listening to me for very long or for a long time, you know that I do pretty regular segments talking to folks who are activists and, in this case, leaders of nonprofits trying to fight gun violence and gun crime and make guns safer at the state and local and federal level, keep them out of bad people's hands and people that would take their own lives potentially with them, and create all kinds of regulations that do help save lives. Well, the Giffords organization is doing great work at that. Their stated mission at Giffords.org is our country's in the grip of a gun violence epidemic. Every American will know a victim of gun violence in their lifetime. This is not normal, and it doesn't have to be this way. Giffords is fighting to end the gun lobby's stranglehold on our political system. We're daring to dream what a future free from gun violence looks like. We're going to end this crisis, and we're going to do it together. Giffords.org if you want to learn more. A lot of great folks over there, and I was very happy to talk to their executive director, Emma Brown. For leading Giffords, she served as Senator Mark Kelly, Gabby Giffords' husband's reelection campaign. She was the campaign manager for him, also served as campaign director for President Biden's campaign in Arizona, winning back in 2020. She's run battleground congressional and state legislative programs in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic. She was named State Campaign Manager of the Year by the American Association of Political Consultants. Very excited to talk to Emma Brown for the first time. You can follow her on social media, Emma_S_Brown, and go to Giffords.org. Let's do it right now for the first time with Emma Brown. Yes, there she is, Emma Brown. Very excited to be talking to such an important person, such an important organization. Thanks for joining.
You're overstating me, but thank you. I'm happy to be here.
No, I read your bio. Look at you. You've ran campaigns. You ran the Senator Mark Kelly's campaign for Senate.
That's right. Yeah. He's actually right over my shoulder, right up there with Gabby. The Washington Post covered the day that we held the Senate in 2022, and we won Arizona. It was a good day.
For people listening, she was pointing to a newspaper article she's got hanging over her shoulder. She doesn't have actually Senator Mark Kelly and Gabby Giffords over her shoulder. But yeah, of course, they're married in case people don't know. But of course, tell us about this organization, Giffords. I mean, I think anybody that when they hear the name Gabby Giffords, if they're of a certain age, they probably know where they were when they heard of that horrific shooting. And so obviously understand to some extent the root of where this organization came from. But where did it come from?
Yeah. Well, everywhere I go with Gabby, people will stop us, airports, coffee shops, halls of Congress, and grab our hands. And I have been really pleased to see that people of a variety of ages, know her story. So for those who might not, so Gabby was a congresswoman from Southern Arizona. She's a Blue Dog Democrat, actually, a gun owner, somebody who is a political moderate from Southern Arizona, and we'll get to that in a minute. But she was targeted in an assassination attempt in January 2011 where there was somebody who came to an event that she was holding in Tucson, Arizona at a Safeway called a Congress on Your Corner, and attacked her and attacked the people there, ended up killing 6 people, nearly killing her. And she sustained a traumatic brain injury. She took a bullet to the head that left her with significant physical and speech disabilities that she still struggles with today. But right around that time, a little bit afterwards, we saw the Sandy Hook shooting. So during Gabby's recovery, she and Senator Kelly, who she's married to, went to Sandy Hook and stood there with the parents of, the kindergartners who had just died, and really realized that we had reached a point in this country where gun violence had become a public health crisis and an epidemic, and there wasn't an organization that represented the voices of political moderates, in particular gun owners, people who are from red states, people who are used to traditions of hunting and gun ownership and have respect for the Second Amendment. Those voices weren't really represented in the gun violence prevention world. And so they founded Giffords now 12 years ago to bring the voices of red state Democrats into the conversation. And I think folks are always surprised to learn how much progress we've made since then. So happy to talk about that. But
yeah, let's definitely talk about the progress. It's important. My friend Ryan Bussey works with you guys, of course.
Yes. Yeah.
And is a perfect person, obviously former gun manufacturer executive, to be voicing those opinions. So, but just before we get into specifics of what you guys have been working on in general, I always like to tell people, because one of the things we hear the most after a horrific shooting, a headline grabbing horrific shooting. You mentioned January 2011 was when Congresswoman Giffords was shot. And in June 25, we had 2 lawmakers assassinated, a lawmaker and her husband assassinated, obviously, as everybody knows about, in Minnesota. And so the violence doesn't end. The targeted violence doesn't end. The political violence doesn't end. And so people often say nothing ever changes. Mm-hmm. And that frustrates the hell out of me, because as an activist and a supporter of organizations like yours, I know things do change all the time. There are wins and triumphs all the time, especially at the state level. And the House has actually passed anti-gun violence legislation. It just doesn't make it through the Senate. The vast majority of Americans would like to see changes, and there are at the state level. But the point I'm trying to make, and this is the most I'll talk here, is just to try to make people understand that there are changes all the time. And when you say that there aren't, it's kind of a slap in the face to Gabby and you and all the rest of the people at your organization and others that actually have done a lot to prevent more gun violence. It would be even worse, arguably. So that's my rant that I always like to make when it comes to this, to just not disenchant people from being part of the solution.
And it's a really important rant. I'm glad you just did my job for me there, Pete. I mean, I think what I would say is that there is a project to cynicism on this issue, right? Yeah. When people think about guns in America, they don't feel hopeful. And there is actually a group of people that hopelessness benefits. It's gun companies and the NRA and the industry whose profit margins and sales depend on this notion that this is just how it is, right? And in reality, this is not just how it is. This wasn't a problem in this country 25 years ago to the extent that it is now. So I think that's an important fact, right? In the 90s, we were not seeing school shootings, every other week.
I mean, if you're over a certain age, I'm 49. If you're over a certain age, you can remember that this was not anywhere near your fears about what something might happen to you in school.
That's right. So fiction number one is that this has always been the case. It has not always been the case. In the modern adult's lifetime, this was not the case. I think fiction number two is that there's been no progress. And again, they want us to feel like there has been no progress. But in reality, in just the last decade, we have been able to pass over 700 laws at the state level in almost every single state to further gun safety. Those laws are working, right? They are saving lives every day, and they are happening in red states and blue states. We passed a machine gun conversion device ban in Alabama this year, right? There is progress that is possible. And then in 2022, we saw the first federal gun safety legislation become law in 30 years. And it had the support of not only every Democrat in the United States Senate, but 15 Republicans, which I bring up to say it was not everything. It wasn't a perfect piece of legislation. It hasn't solved the crisis, but it does prove that progress is possible when we invest in the work and we're doing it year in and year out. And we're in a very different place than we were 10 years ago in terms of the politics of this issue, in terms of the bipartisan support for this issue. And, every year Giffords puts out a scorecard where we give every state a grade, A to F. And you can see that states that have A or B ratings, there are fewer people dying, right, in those states. There is an obvious relationship between strong gun laws and fewer lives lost.
There's new data about that, I think, recently that I just saw. Wasn't there some big headline grabbing piece of data about that? Because it correlates almost perfectly to what you just said.
Yes. Yeah, there are studies done that fewer kids are dying. And there was a recent study that came out that there are fewer school shootings, right, in states that have stronger gun laws.
Isn't gun violence the leading cause of death for young people, for people under a certain age in America?
Yes. Leading cause of death for American kids, more so than cancer or cars. And I think that is something that has changed in recent years. That has become the case in the Trump era in this country. And I know that sort of brings us back, but, gun homicides jumped 35% in the president's first term, right? In President Trump's first administration. They've increased considerably. And what we see from this administration, and there was news this morning about the way that they're really going after federal law enforcement to weaken the ATF, which is a federal law enforcement agency that prosecutes gun crime. We see an administration that's very hostile on this issue. So we have a lot at stake right now. But what I will say is that we have made progress in the last couple of years, and that progress is saving lives, which is also why you see the lowest violent crime rate in almost 50 years in most major American cities right now.
That and a whole bunch of other reasons we can unpack, but the ATF doesn't even have, I believe, like a head of their agency. I think Trump nominated an actual gun to be the head of the.
Yeah. The Secretary of the Army actually is currently the head of the ATF, which make sense.
I think that one way of looking at the cuts to ATF is a cut to police. It's defunding the police when you defund, but they don't like the federal police, especially the federal police who regulate guns. I don't know how they feel about tobacco and alcohol regulation, but they certainly don't like the F in that acronym.
Right. And I think it's important for your listeners to also just know what the ATF is, right? The ATF is the only federal law enforcement agency that is solely focused on violent crime. And so they focus on gun trafficking. They focus on prosecuting gun crimes. They focus on keeping firearms out of the hands of people with criminal backgrounds. So weakening the ATF is defunding the police. And this is an administration that talks a lot about law and order, right? They talk a lot about going after criminals. What we are seeing from them, the news that came out this morning, the Washington Post reported that DOJ has now gotten to the ATF and is proposing slashing its budget by 25%. That is the most radical proposal to defund the police that we have ever seen from a federal government in any context, right? Which is shocking. And I think that it's really important that people know that because, Trump has a lot of credibility in the eyes of Americans on safety and crime. And in reality, he is doing a lot to make this country more dangerous.
Other issue that's in the news just the last couple of days to talk with you about is around gun silencers, which it's harder to find any levity about gun violence. And certainly when you're talking to someone who leads an organization trying to prevent it, but the idea that someone needs a silencer to me is funny. It's not funny because it's horrific, but it's like what outside of in a movie do you need a silencer for? I know a lot about guns and a lot of people I know have guns. I don't know anybody who's got a silencer or at least admits to it, but for some reason in this big bad bill that the House passed that's now in the Senate being negotiated, they inserted this law, which you can talk about, that allows people to provision on silencers that you can speak to. But the triumph apparently is it was taken out of the Senate bill because it doesn't pass the test about parliamentary procedure, and we can get into the weeds about it, but it's out. And so tell us about this provision, why it was required, who the hell needs a silencer for what? Who's lobbying for silencers? I've always said this about my anti-gun friends in these arguments. I'm like, what gun rights don't you have? You can do whatever you want to your gun. You can buy whatever gun you want, whenever you want, from whoever you want. And apparently you just put a silencer on it. It's crazy to me. this is a thing. Explain this.
Yeah, well, I would start with the fact that you talked about this earlier. A couple of weeks ago, we saw the hunting and assassination of a Minnesota legislator, right? There was somebody in Minnesota who had unraveled. The reporting is that he was in the midst of a mental health crisis. He was rolling around with 3 AK-47s and military gear and a list of legislators. And he was driving to their houses in the middle of the night.
I just gotta stop. The mental health crisis thing, when it's attributed to somebody who does a bad thing with a gun, it irks the hell out of me, because this guy was radicalized by his religion far before this. And the same is true of any other, all these terrorists. Like we rarely talk about their mental health crises, but that's just for my listeners who heard that I always want to be like, all right, fair enough. But also he believed crazy shit long before he started having I come undone like once a week. So,
yeah, well, I think however you slice it, this is not somebody who should have had access to these guns. And we will learn more in the coming weeks, I am sure, about how he had access to them, how this all happened. But the point is that we live in a country where there was a person who was that dangerous, conspiracy theorist, however you want to frame it. And he went, to these houses in the middle of the night. He shot and killed Melissa Hortman and her husband, who, by the way, was a friend of Gabby's and our organization. She worked with us in Minnesota, ironically, to pass, the state's leading gun safety bills in 2023 when she was the speaker. So it is a tremendous loss for us, for the whole country. And I think it's important that we take a step back on that for a second and just talk about the fact that the reaction to Melissa Hortman's assassination, what you heard from everybody over and over again was political violence is unacceptable. That is the thing that people tweeted. That is the thing that everybody said. Of course, that is true. The problem is that it has become increasingly acceptable in this country. Gabby Giffords, of course, was almost assassinated in 2011. We have seen a rise in political violence, primarily targeting women and people of color in elected office. And I think what is important and something I wanted to make sure that we talked about is the fact that people always blame the rhetoric, right? Heightened political rhetoric, high temperatures, polarization, that's a part of it. But, I would really argue that that's only half the story. The other half of the story is the fact that we had somebody in the situation who was very dangerous and he had easy access to extreme weapons. Yep. He was rolling around town with them, hunting legislators. And so bringing that back around to the silencers, it was about a day after this happened that Senate Republicans introduced their version of the big, terrible bill, right? And their version included a provision that would take silencers out of the National Firearms Act, which was passed in the 1930s. So we have been protecting Americans from silencers since the 1930s. And the reason for that is that they are usually used, when they're used in crimes, they're used by assassins, right? They're used by people who are trying to hide from law enforcement and whose gunshots, they are looking to muffle. And so it was really astounding that Senate Republicans would include the provision making silencers accessible, a day after a Minnesota lawmaker was hunted down and assassinated in her own home. And I will just say, we did some polling on this when it was first proposed. 74% of Americans think that silencers must have a background check, right? Which by the way includes 59% of Trump voters. There is clear majority consensus that we should not just be giving people silencers.
What are they for? What are they for? Who are they for? They're not for law enforcement. They're not for hunters. Yeah. They're not for anyone. They shouldn't be a thing, but for movie assassins.
Yeah, and there are some.
Here's a silencer. Come on the show. Talk to me about your silencer and what other weird things you do in your life. Sorry.
No. I mean, there are some hunters who use silencers to help, muffle the sounds of their gunshots. But what I would say to that
either for who? The neighbor, maybe not for the animal. The animal has a hard enough chance. Bow hunt.
What I would say to that is that those hunters are able to get their silencers, right? But they have to pass a background check. So there's no problem right now with the accessibility of silencers for people who could lawfully have them. The problem is, of course, if you allow anybody with any kind of background to just get a silencer, you can imagine what might happen.
What is the work that your organization is doing day to day? Why should people listening support that work?
Well, so, I think you made this point earlier, but we are making a tremendous amount of progress on the state level and actually, believe it or not, on the federal level just a couple of years ago. So, this year, we really focused our work in red and purple states, building coalitions of gun owners and law enforcement and moderate Republicans and Democrats to pull together gun legislation at the state level where we can be successful. So just this year, we have been able to pass legislation in Colorado that protects polling locations from armed intimidation. We've been able to pass a licensing bill in Washington state. We were able to pass community violence intervention in Texas, believe it or not, this year. As I said, a first of its kind machine gun conversion device ban in Alabama. And so we believe that making progress at the state level, making progress in red and purple states puts us in a position to be able to make progress federally. And I always talk about, when Gabby first got involved in this work after Sandy Hook, she was walking around the halls of Congress. 20 kindergartners had died in a classroom. And she was trying to convince Democrats to get on federal background check legislation. And if you recall, we failed by 4 votes in that case because we couldn't get Democrats to even vote for background checks. You fast forward 10 years and you have the Uvalde shooting. It's the same situation. It is a horrible moment for the country. But this time we have the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act 3 weeks later. And that legislation had every Democrat and 15 Republicans on it. And so the progress is possible. It has to be done at the state level painstakingly. And ultimately, we are after saving as many people as we possibly can from this problem.
You guys endorse candidates?
We do. Yes, we do.
So a good place to look then to see who you've endorsed on these issues. You're doing the work for us in that case. One last question about one provision I'm pretty interested in. I talk a lot about the issues regarding men and boys, depression, loneliness, suicide, and so on. And one thing my understanding is that a waiting period to purchase a gun would statistically save lots of lives, especially of men and boys who commit suicide with a gun. Yeah. Because basically today I feel like dying and I want to die. And I've been there myself. And the last few years have been I've talked about this openly many, many times, but I'm always glad that I didn't have a gun in my house at certain periods because you start drinking, there's a gun. And I just understand that there could be a lot of fathers and husbands and men in general that might still be here had they given one day between the moment, the impulse buy that they can in many places make that purchase to take their own life. What do you think about that waiting period provision as it pertains to suicide, as it pertains to men on the statistics? And maybe I'm being too specific, but it's just something I've heard before and something I personally think about when thinking about men and the battles that they're having with depression.
Yeah, you're not being too specific. I mean, you're exactly right. You're having a really bad day today. It looks like there might not be a future, but you might feel differently tomorrow. And what we understand is that the presence of a firearm, the ability to access a gun in that moment of crisis makes the likelihood that you die infinitely higher. I think folks often don't realize that actually over half of the gun deaths in this country are suicides. And we understand that one of the best ways that we can save people's lives is to just give it a beat, right? When they are in the moment of crisis, they are looking to get a firearm. If you can just have a cooling off period or a waiting period of a couple of days, and then you get that person their gun right, you're not denying their constitutional rights, but you're just giving it a few days, it can save a life a lot of the time. So that is a leading solution for us, as well as safe storage, as well as red flag laws, which allow the friends and family of a gun owner to tell the court that they are a danger to themselves and temporarily separate them from their firearm. So suicide, is a core driver of gun violence in this country. And again, it's not like we're without solutions. We know what the solutions are. We know that they work. They are working at the state level across the country. And where we have waiting periods, there are fewer people taking their own lives, because if they don't have the gun, as you said, they are much likely to pass.
Emma, it's great talking to you. You're doing great work. It's really, really hard to do the work that you do, to report to work every day and to talk about this issue. I can't possibly imagine. So thank you very much for talking about it with me and for doing all the work to you and everybody at your organization. I really appreciate it. Really look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, Pete. It was really great to be with you.
All right. Emma Brown, there she goes, Giffords.org. Support them, follow her, let them know that you heard her here on today's episode of Stand Up. I can't do any of these daily episodes without your support. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. You can go pay more if you're already paying, and if you're not, please sign up now for as little as $5 or as much as you want. Go subscribe to me on Substack. I'm going to be hitting it hard over there this week, as well as youtube.com/standupwithpete, where you can see this and many other interviews. And if you don't see something there that you'd like, or you want me to do something that I'm not doing, I'd love to hear from you. Standupwithpete@gmail.com is my email. That's all I've got today. I want to get this up. Go download John Carroll's album. This is him singing right now. If you don't know him, he's the Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter and one of the original founding members of the Starland Vocal Band. That's right. That's our John Carroll. Go get it, and I will talk to you tomorrow and tonight at our hangout. All right. Be well, my friends. Find peace. Find joy. Find the love. Look around. It's there.